The road stretched out before him, illuminated only by the faint glow of his headlights as Jack sped down the highway. The night was unusually quiet, the kind that made every small sound seem magnified. His mind was scattered, caught between flashes of anxiety and the overwhelming need to reach somewhere. But where? That thought faded as quickly as it had arrived, drowned out by the screech of tires and the sudden loss of control. It all happened in an instant. The wheel jerked in his hands and the car veered off the road, smashing through the barrier before rolling into the ravine below. The impact was violent, throwing Jack against the steering wheel as the world went black. Rain began to fall, gentle at first, but soon a steady downpour. Taylor had been inside, preparing for a stormy evening alone in her small, rural cabin, when the distant sound of twisting metal pierced the air. It was unmistakable, a car crash. Her heart raced as she threw on a jacket and grabbed her flashlight, running out into the cold, wet night. The road wasn't far from her home, just a few hundred yards, and as she reached the scene, she saw the faint outline of the car's wreckage down the hill. Climbing down carefully, Taylor shined her light into the vehicle. Inside, a man, unconscious, bleeding, lay slumped over the wheel. "Hang on," she whispered, though he was too far gone to hear her. With no signal on her phone, Taylor knew there wasn't time to wait for help. She worked quickly, prying open the door and dragging his limp body out of the twisted metal. It took all her strength to get him up the hill, but eventually she managed to haul him back to her cabin. Once inside, she laid him on the couch, grabbing towels to clean the cuts on his face. He was breathing, but only just. Whoever he was fighting for his life. Taylor looked at him, a stranger who had appeared in her world without warning. His clothes were torn, his features barely recognizable under the dirt and blood. Yet there was something about him that stirred an unfamiliar sense of urgency in her. She couldn't quite place it, but she knew one thing. She couldn't let him die. The soft murmur of the wind outside was the first sound Jack registered as he slowly drifted back to consciousness. His body felt heavy, his head pounding with a dull ache that made it hard to focus. He blinked, trying to make sense of his surroundings. An unfamiliar room, the faint scent of wood smoke in the air, and a woman sitting nearby, watching him with quiet concern. "Where am I?" His voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. Taylor, startled by the sudden sound, moved closer. "You're safe. You had an accident. I found you near the road and brought you here," she explained, her voice soft but steady. "Do you remember what happened?" Jack closed his eyes for a moment, trying to pull at the loose threads of his memory, but it was like grasping at air. Every time he thought he had something, it slipped away. He frowned, his mind clouded in confusion. I can't remember anything." A look of concern flickered across Taylor's face, but she quickly masked it. "It's okay," she reassured him, though even she knew the situation was far from okay. "You've been out for a couple of days. Your memory might come back with time." He let out a deep, frustrated breath, the weight of the unknown pressing down on him. "What's my name?" The question felt absurd, but it was all he had. Taylor hesitated, glancing at him with an awkward smile. "I don't know. There was nothing on you when I found you. No wallet, no ID. Nothing to tell me who you are. You were just there." Jack tried to sit up, but a sharp pain shot through his side, forcing him to lie back down. Taylor quickly moved to his side, gently pressing him back into the cushions. "You need to rest. You were in pretty bad shape when I found you." He nodded, grateful for her help, but deeply unsettled by the emptiness in his mind. The world outside was a blur, but here, in this cabin with Taylor, there was a strange sense of safety. Even in his confusion, he felt like he could trust her, like she was the one solid thing in a sea of uncertainty. As she walked away to prepare some food, Jack lay back, the silence of the room amplifying the noise in his head. He didn't just feel lost, he felt like a stranger to himself. He tried again, desperately reaching for any memory that could tether him to an identity, a purpose, but nothing came. Who was he? And why, even in the emptiness, did the sight of Taylor bring a strange comfort? Days passed and Jack's recovery progressed, though the fog around his memory remained. He settled into a quiet rhythm at Taylor's cabin, helping her with small chores, trying to be useful in any way he could. Without the context of who he had been before, the simplicity of their life together was oddly soothing. Each morning, Jack would rise with the sound of birds chirping outside the window. The scent of fresh coffee and wood smoke filled the air as Taylor moved about, going about her daily routine. It was peaceful, an escape from the noise and confusion of the world he couldn't remember. But there was something else, too. Jack couldn't shake the growing connection he felt with Taylor. It wasn't just gratitude, it was something deeper. In the quiet moments between them, when they sat in the living room or shared meals, Jack felt a warmth that he couldn't explain. Every now and then their eyes would meet, and there was something in her gaze, something unspoken that mirrored his own emotions. One evening, as they sat on the porch, the sun casting a warm glow over the landscape, Jack turned to her. "Do you ever think about starting over?" he asked softly. The question hung in the air, charged with meaning. Taylor looked at him, her expression thoughtful. "Sometimes," she admitted, her voice quiet. "But most people don't get that chance." Jack nodded, though a small part of him couldn't help but wonder if this was exactly what he had been given, a second chance. As days turned into weeks, the urgency to remember who he had been started to fade. He began to feel like the man he was now mattered more than whoever he had been before the accident. Yet, in the back of his mind, a faint echo of his forgotten past lingered, casting a long shadow over the quiet happiness he had found. The tension between Jack and Taylor was palpable, though neither had acknowledged it outright. Every glance, every touch, felt loaded with unspoken meaning. As much as Jack had tried to ignore it, his feelings for her had grown beyond anything he could control. One evening, they sat together on the porch, watching the stars emerge one by one. Jack felt the pull again, stronger than ever. He glanced at Taylor, her face illuminated by the soft glow of moonlight. Before he could think, he reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. Taylor stiffened at first, but then her grip tightened. They sat in silence for a moment, the air between them thick with emotion. Finally, Jack couldn't hold back any longer. He turned toward her, his voice barely above a whisper. "Taylor." She looked at him, her eyes filled with both longing and fear. "Jack, I—" But before she could finish, Jack leaned in, pressing his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle at first, testing the waters of this new reality between them. But as Taylor responded, it deepened, both of them giving in to the feelings they had tried so hard to deny. When they pulled apart, Taylor's eyes were shining with unshed tears. "This feels right," she whispered. "But what if your past comes back?" Jack's heart tightened at her words. He had tried to bury the fear, but the truth lingered. "I don't know," he admitted, "but right now, this is the only thing that feels real." Taylor looked away, her fingers still entwined with his. "What if you remember something? Someone?" Jack hesitated, the weight of the unknown pressing down on him. He couldn't promise her anything, and that uncertainty was what terrified him most. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway jolted Jack out of his thoughts. He exchanged a glance with Taylor, who immediately stiffened. It was rare for them to get visitors, and something about the timing felt off. Jack stepped outside just as the driver's door opened, and a man in a suit stepped out. "Excuse me," the man called out, walking toward Jack with a sense of purpose. "I'm looking for someone." Jack's heart raced. "Who are you looking for?" The man pulled out a photograph and handed it to him. Jack stared at the picture. It was a photo of a man who looked exactly like him. "His name is John Walker," the man said. "His wife has been searching for him for weeks." Jack felt the ground shift beneath him. John Walker. Wife? His mind raced, grasping at the name and the implications, but nothing clicked. I don't know that name," Jack stammered, feeling Taylor come up behind him. The man's expression didn't change. "I'm a private investigator. You may not remember, but you are John Walker. Your wife, Sarah, has been looking for you since you disappeared." The words hit Jack like a punch to the gut. He could feel Taylor's body tense next to him, the fear and uncertainty she had voiced now crashing into reality. He stared at the photo again, willing something, anything, to come back to him. But all he felt was a strange detachment, like the man in the picture was a ghost of someone else. Taylor's voice was shaky as she finally spoke. "Jack, what's going on?" Jack looked at her, his own confusion mirrored in her eyes. "I don't know," he whispered. But the unease building inside him told him that everything was about to change. The silence between Jack and Taylor stretched thin as the investigator led them into town. Jack's mind buzzed with fragments, disconnected, incoherent memories that stirred at the name John Walker. He stared out the window, lost in thoughts he couldn't grasp, while Taylor sat beside him, her face pale and expression guarded. When they arrived at the small diner, Jack felt his stomach churn. Inside, a woman sat at a corner booth, her hands trembling as she clutched a napkin in her lap. The moment she looked up and met Jack's eyes, a sharp pang of recognition hit him. Not a full memory, just a flash of something buried deep, like a photograph glimpsed in passing. The woman, Sarah, stood slowly, her eyes wide with hope and something more. "John," her voice was soft, fragile. "I thought I'd never find you." Jack remained frozen. Part of him wanted to step toward her, to comfort her, but he couldn't. He didn't feel like the man she was searching for. He turned to Taylor, who looked back at him with a mixture of fear and sadness, as if bracing herself for the inevitable. "I don't remember you," Jack said at last, his voice thick. "I don't remember any of this." Sarah's eyes welled with tears, though she tried to remain composed. "We were falling apart," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Even before the accident. I wasn't sure if you were leaving for good that night, or if it was just another one of our fights." Jack's heart ached with the weight of her words. He could feel the echoes of a strained marriage, but nothing felt real enough to grab hold of. It was as if he were watching someone else's life, removed from the emotions that once bound him to it. "I don't feel like that man," Jack said quietly, his eyes searching Sarah's for some kind of understanding. "I'm not John Walker. Not anymore." Sarah wiped at her eyes and nodded slowly. "Maybe that's for the best. I've had time to think, and I know that what we had was broken. I just needed to see you." There was a sadness in her words, but also a sense of acceptance. Sarah knew, just as Jack did, that the man standing before her was no longer the husband she had once known. "I'm sorry," Jack whispered, unsure if the apology was for leaving, for forgetting, or for not being the person she needed him to be. Sarah stood, offering him a sad, fleeting smile. "Take care of yourself, John, or whoever you choose to be." As Sarah walked away, Jack felt a heavy mixture of relief and sorrow settle over him. His past, so long forgotten, was now just a fractured reflection, a life he couldn't return to, even if he wanted to. When he finally turned to face Taylor, she remained quiet, her expression unreadable. The past had found its way back to him, but it was clear now. His future lay elsewhere. The drive back to the cabin was filled with a heavy silence, broken only by the hum of the car's engine. Jack could feel the weight of his decision settling in, the finality of leaving his past behind. Sarah's face lingered in his mind, the sadness in her eyes as she let him go. But that life, that man, felt distant now, like an old photograph he no longer recognized. As they pulled up to the cabin, Taylor stepped out of the car quickly, her pace brisk, as if she needed distance. Jack followed her inside, unsure of how to bridge the growing tension between them. He had made his decision, but he could see that Taylor was still battling with her own doubts, her own fears about what this meant for them. She stood in the kitchen, her back to him as she stared out the window. The tension in her shoulders was unmistakable. Jack approached her slowly, his heart heavy with the weight of the words he knew he needed to say. "I'm not going back to that life," Jack said softly, standing a few feet behind her. "I don't remember it. And even if I did, I don't think I'd want to." Taylor remained silent, her hands gripping the counter. Jack took a deep breath and continued. "I can't be John Walker. Whoever that man was, his life doesn't feel like mine anymore." Taylor finally turned around, her eyes searching his face. "And what about us?" she asked, her voice quiet but edged with uncertainty. "What happens now?" Jack stepped closer, his gaze steady. "I choose this life. With you. I'm not tied to a past I can't remember, but I know what feels real to me now. And that's you." Taylor's eyes flickered with something, relief maybe, but it was tempered by the hesitation she still carried. "But what if you do remember? What if one day it all comes back and you realize you were meant to be with her?" Jack reached for her hands, holding them tightly in his. "If that happens, then I'll deal with it. But right now, I'm making a choice. I want a life with you, Taylor, not with someone from a past I don't know. I'm not the man I used to be, whoever he was." Taylor looked at him, her expression softening as his words sank in. Slowly, she nodded, the walls she had built around herself beginning to crack. I didn't want to lose you," she whispered. "You're not going to," Jack promised, pulling her into his arms. "I'm right here. This is where I want to be." They stood together for a long moment, the weight of the past finally slipping away, leaving only the present, only them. The sun hung low in the sky as Jack and Taylor sat together on the porch, the world around them bathed in a warm, golden light. The air was still, filled only with the soft sounds of the evening, the rustle of leaves, the distant chirp of crickets. It was a peaceful silence, one that carried the weight of everything they had been through. Jack leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The tension that had followed him for weeks seemed to have finally eased, replaced by a quiet sense of clarity. The man he had been, John Walker, felt like a distant shadow now, a life that no longer defined him. He turned to Taylor, who was sitting beside him, her hand resting gently in his. For the first time in days, her face was relaxed, her eyes soft as she looked out over the landscape. The uncertainty that had once haunted her seemed to have faded, replaced by a quiet confidence in the choice they had made together. "I've been thinking," Jack said quietly, breaking the silence. Taylor glanced at him, waiting. "Maybe forgetting wasn't a curse after all," he continued, his voice thoughtful. "Maybe it was a chance to start over, to become someone new." Taylor gave him a small smile, her eyes reflecting the same thought. "Sometimes we have to let go of the past to find out who we really are," she said softly. Jack nodded, the weight of those words settling in. He wasn't John Walker anymore. The accident had stripped him of the identity he once had, but in its place he had found something different, something real. The life he had now with Taylor felt like a second chance, a choice he had made consciously, rather than a path set out for him by circumstances beyond his control. There was peace in that realization. "Do you ever wonder what kind of man I was?" Jack asked, though the question felt less urgent than it had before. Taylor smiled softly. "I wonder," she admitted. "But the man you are now, that's the one who matters to me." Jack squeezed her hand, a sense of calm settling over him. Whoever he had been before the accident, it didn't define him anymore. The choices he made now, the life he was building with Taylor, that was what mattered. They sat together as the last light of day faded into night, the world around them quiet and still. The future stretched out before them, uncertain but full of possibility. And for the first time in a long time, Jack felt ready to embrace it. This story reminds us that our past doesn't have to define our future. We all carry the weight of who we've been, but it's the choices we make today that truly shape who we are. Sometimes we need to let go of old versions of ourselves to embrace the life waiting for us. New beginnings aren't always easy, but they give us the opportunity to live authentically without the burden of past mistakes or expectations. What did you think of the story? If you have any comments, suggestions, or ideas for new stories, feel free to share them below. We'd love to hear from you. Also, don't forget to follow the channel and turn on notifications to stay updated with our latest stories. There's plenty more coming your way.